Want to welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for part 2 of our Midwestern Bumblebee ID course. Today we are going to be covering 6 different species of bumblebees that you can find in the Midwestern United States. The rusty patch bumblebee, the red-belted bumblebee, the tricolored bumblebee, Hunt's bumblebee, the yellow bumblebee, and the northern amber bumblebee. Just as a reminder, if you missed part 1 of this webinar series, don't sweat it. We will be posting a recording of that video to YouTube soon. So we will be referencing some content that we covered in part 1 of the webinar series today. And if it's a little unfamiliar to you, you can always go back and review it at a later date. So just a quick outline for today. Today is going to be all about Bumblebee ID for these 6 different species of bumblebees. Most of these bumblebees are bees that sort of stand out because they have either some reddish hair, are red bumblebees here, or they have lots of yellow. Before we jump right into Bumblebee ID, I just wanted to give you guys a really quick review of some of the bumblebee anatomy concepts that we covered last week. Last week we went into quite a bit of depth regarding bumblebee anatomy, but I just wanted to give you a quick refresher so that these terms are familiar to you as we cover the content of today's webinar. So if we think of a bumblebee being separated into 3 parts, we have the bumblebee's head. Today we're going to be talking a lot about the colors of the hairs on the bumblebee's face, as well as the top of the head or vertex. We will also be talking about the hair color patterns on the thorax, that second part of the bumblebee's body. So that is the place on the bumblebee where the legs attach and where the wings attach. We will be talking quite a bit about the hair color pattern between the wing joints, which is where the 2 wings attach, as well as underneath the wing joints on the sides of the thorax. The last part of the bumblebee's body that we'll be talking quite a bit about is the abdomen, which is that last part here. The abdomen is segmented, and each one of these segments has a name and a label. So we have T1, T2, T3, T4, T5, sort of moving backwards from where the abdomen connects to the thorax. And T here stands for tergite. So each one of those segments is called a tergite. And we'll be talking quite a bit about the color patterns on the abdominal segments, or tergites. So our very first bumblebee that we will be discussing today is the rusty patch bumblebee, or Bombus affinis. This is everybody's favorite bumblebee, at least in Minnesota. It's the state bumblebee here. And it is very, very well known because it is an endangered species. So this was the first bumblebee species to be listed as endangered in the United States federally. And this bumblebee gets its name from the rusty patch that it has on its abdomen. So if you guys remember from last week, I really like to work backwards to forwards when I'm looking at different bumblebees to identify them. So if we focus in on the abdomen of the bumblebee and those color patterns there, for the rusty patch bumblebee, that first tergite, or that first abdominal segment, is going to be yellow. That second abdominal segment is also going to be yellow, but it will have a patch of rusty color for the workers. So you can really see that in this photo here. We have the first segment of the abdomen yellow, the second segment is also yellow, but with that rusty patch color there. The rest of the abdomen is black. So T3 through 6 on the workers is black. If we move on to the thorax, where the legs and the wing joints attach, the thorax of the rusty patch bumblebee is mostly yellow. It does have an umbrella-shaped pattern in between the 2 wing joints, or you can kind of think of it as being a thumbtack shape. So if we look at the cartoon of the rusty patch bumblebee right here, you can really see that little thumbtack shape. It's not super visible in the photo example, but we will be going through lots of examples where you'll be able to see that thumbtack shape really well. Rusty patch bumblebees also have dark hairs underneath the wing joints, which you can see in this example photo here. So the thorax is mostly yellow, but they have some dark hairs right there in what I kind of think of as being like the armpit of the bee, where their wing joints attach to their thorax. I always like to look at the head last, just to make sure that the color patterns of the hairs line up with what I expect. So for rusty patch bumblebees, their hairs on the front of their face and on the top of their head are going to be black. Also of note is the fact that rusty patch bumblebees have a short face, so they have short cheeks and a roundish shaped head when you look at them straight on, and this is a really nice characteristic to look out for when you're identifying rusty patch bumblebees to species. So we just talked about the color patterns for the workers. Rusty patch bumblebees, for rusty patch bumblebees, the queens look pretty different from the workers a lot of the time. So unlike the workers, which have that characteristic rusty patch bumblebee queens actually often have solid yellow color on their thorax or on their abdomen. So working backwards from the abdomen to the head, if we look at the abdomen of a queen rusty patch bumblebee, T1 and T2 will often be solidly yellow. Sometimes you'll get a queen with a little bit of rusty patch color on T2, but a lot of the times there won't be any evidence of a rusty patch at all. The rest of the abdominal segments will be black, so T3 through 6 will be black. Looking at the thorax of the bee, the thorax of the rusty patch bumblebee will be yellow. For the queens, they will often have a black spot. So they don't have that umbrella shape that you think of when you think of workers. They just have a little dot there in between the two wing joints of black hairs. Once again, the queens will have dark hairs underneath their wing joints as well. So if you think about the armpit of the bee being that spot underneath the wing joints, if you look on a rusty patch queen, you'll see some dark hairs there. Once again, the hairs for the queens, like the workers, will be black on the top of the head, as well as black on the front of the face. One thing to note about rusty patch bumblebee queens is that they are quite large. So they're not quite as big as a black and gold bumblebee or an American bumblebee, if you're familiar with those species, but they are a lot bigger than some of the yellower bumblebee species that you might encounter in the region. So, you know, the common eastern bumblebee, the two-spotted bumblebee, the queens of rusty patch bumblebees are going to be larger than that. And so one of the first things I look out for when I'm trying to identify whether or not something's a rusty patch bumblebee queen in the field is whether or not it's a huge giant bee. All right, last we have the males. The male color patterning is very, very similar to that of the workers. Once again, we have the abdomen featuring that characteristic rusty patch. So T1 for males is going to be yellow. T2 is going to be yellow with that rusty patch in the center. And then T through 7 will be black. The thorax also will generally have a sort of umbrella-shaped black spot in the center and will be primarily yellow. And then if you look at the head, the hairs on the front of the face for males will be black, and then the hairs on the top of the head will be black, but you'll often see yellow hairs mixed in there as well for the males. The males and the female color pattern is very, very similar. So when you're trying to differentiate between male and female rusty patch bumblebees, the one thing to really look for is the shape of the leg. So last week, when we were talking about differentiating between males and females, we talked quite a bit about looking for the pollen baskets on the legs of female bees for non-Xerces species. So just as a reminder of what that looks like, for female bumblebees that aren't Xerces or cuckoo bumblebees, what we want to look out for is that pollen basket. So if you look at the hind leg of the bumblebee in that middle segment, what you're looking for is a triangular shaped segment that is bald in the middle with hairs all around the edges. And that's going to be the area of the bumblebee that they're going to be packing in their pollen. If you look at a male bumblebee, they're not going to have evidence of a pollen basket at all. Their leg, that middle segment, is much rounder, especially at the bottom. It's a lot thinner. Their legs in general are a lot more spindly looking than the leg of a female bumblebee. And then you'll also notice, if you look closely, that they will have hairs all over the segment of their leg. So if you look really, really closely, you'll see some hairs here in the middle. For the female bees, that's going to be bald, right? Because that's where they're going to be putting their pollen. And I'll note that the two example bumblebees that you see here aren't rusty patch bumblebees, but you're going to be looking for the exact same thing on rusty patch bumblebees when you are trying to differentiate between males and females. That triangular shaped segment on the hind leg, right in the middle, right? The middle segment there. All right, so let's look at some examples of rusty patch bumblebee workers. All right, so here we have two very, very great examples of rusty patch bumblebee workers. The first thing that I always zoom in on is what is going on with that second segment of the abdomen. And we can see here for both of these individuals, they have just a really bright patch of rusty color. Zooming in a little bit more on the abdomen, we see that T1 is yellow, just as we would expect. T2 is yellow, except for right in the middle, we have that rusty patch of color. And then the rest of the abdomen is black. If we zoom in on the thorax here of this bee, you can also see some evidence of that T-shaped dark spot in between the two wing joints. So we have a dark pattern here of hairs that looks like a little umbrella or a T or a thumbtack. And those dark hairs extend all the way down to the bottom of the thorax. Just a few more examples of rusty patch bumblebee workers. From this profile view of this bumblebee, you can clearly see some of the patterning that we couldn't see in those photos I just showed you, namely the dark hairs underneath the wing joints. From this angle, you can really see that this bee has some dark hairs, right? That's not just a shadow. Those are the hair colors themselves are black underneath those wings. You can also see the color patterns on the face. So we see that the hairs on the front of the face and on the top of the head are black. From this angle, we can also see that triangular shaped pollen basket area on their leg. So when we're looking at females, we're looking for that triangular shape with a bald area in the middle there where they're going to be packing their pollen. In this second photo that you see to the right, we can also see the color patterns that are really typical for rusty patch bumblebee worker. Those dark hairs on the front of the face, dark hairs on the top of the head. There are a few light hairs intermixed there, but that is something you will occasionally encounter with rusty patch bumblebees. We can see that pattern on the thorax, that umbrella shape, as well as the rusty patch pattern on T2, the abdomen. Moving on to queens, here are some really great examples of rusty patch bumblebee queens. So as you can see, these look really different than the workers. The queens have a abdomen with solid yellow on both T1 and T2. The rest of the abdomen is black. We see that the thorax of the bee is yellow. It has a little spot in the middle of black, and then underneath the wing joints, we see some dark hairs. The hairs on the front of the face and the top of the head are generally black. You may see a few yellow hairs mixed in on the top of the head, especially for queens. One thing to look out for rusty patch bumblebees is the length of the cheeks. Rusty patch bumblebees have shorter cheeks than some of the other species that you might get them confused with. If we zoom in on the cheek of the rusty patch bumblebee here, it's a little bit hard to make out, but if we look at the bottom of the cheek, so where it attaches to the mandible here, it is longer than it is the width is longer than the height of the cheek. So rusty patch bumblebees are bees that have sort of a roundish looking head because of those short cheeks. All right. Here we have a few examples of rusty patch bumblebee males. So as I mentioned previously, the color patterning is very, very similar between the workers and the males of this species. Rusty patch bumblebee males also have a pattern on their abdomen that features that rusty patch. So T1 will be yellow, T2 will be yellow with a rusty patch there in the middle. The rest of the abdomen will be black. If we look at the thorax of the males, they will often have a T shape as well, although sometimes this T shape is a little bit more faded than what you will typically see for the workers. So this example here, you can see that the male's T-shaped spot in between its wing joints is really more of a spot. The T's edges are getting a little bit faded there as the hairs aren't quite as dark as they would be, as you would expect for a female. But you still can kind of make out that T shape. The last thing to look at is the hair color patterns on the top of the head and the front of the face. As I mentioned earlier, males tend to have more yellow hairs on the top of the head than do the females, the workers or the queens. And then the hairs on the front of the face for males are also going to be dark. So just a couple things to look out for when you're trying to differentiate between males and females is the color patterns on the top of the head and face. All right, there are a few different species of bumblebees that you might mix up between rusty patch bumblebee. A lot of the time when folks are just getting started with their bee ID, they will mix up rusty patch bumblebee and brown-belted bumblebee. Brown-belted bumblebees are a species that we covered last week, so this bee should look a little bit familiar. Brown-belted bumblebees, as we discussed last week, have that really characteristic brownish reddish patch of hairs on T2. And so when people see brown-belted bumblebees, they will often zoom in on that patch of hair and think, oh, it's a rusty patch bumblebee. I see that patch of brownish hairs on that second segment of the abdomen. But the rusty patch bumblebees looks a little bit different than the brown-belted bumblebee. So brown-belted bumblebees, they'll have that patch of brownish hairs, but the rest of the segment of the abdomen is going to be black. So you can make out that crescent of hairs, and then the rest of the segment has dark hairs. The rusty patch bumblebee, in contrast, while they have that rusty patch color there in the center of that segment of the abdomen, the rest of the abdominal segment is yellow. So that is the key thing to look out for when you're differentiating between these two species. You also are going to want to look for the color patterns on the thorax. For brown-belted bumblebees, they have a dot in the middle of their thorax, whereas rusty patch bumblebees are going to have that umbrella shape. The queens can be harder to identify than the workers, right? I feel like rusty patch bumblebees are super charismatic. They're super they're just really generally easy to spot once you know what to look out for the workers, but the queens are a little bit tougher because they don't have that characteristic rusty patch in the middle. So when you are starting out in BID, you may get rusty patch bumblebee queens mixed up with other bumblebee species that have yellow on T1 and T2, like the half-black bumblebee. So some things to look out for when you're differentiating between half-black bumblebees and rusty patch bumblebees is the length of the hair. So half-black bumblebees tend to be pretty shaggy looking. When you compare them to rusty patch bumblebees, which have much neater looking hairs, it almost looks like they have a little bit of a buzz cut. Rusty patch bumblebee queens, as I mentioned earlier, are also really, really huge. They are gigantic bees. In contrast, half-black bumblebees are much smaller. So that's another thing to look out for when you're in the field and you can really see how big these different bees are. Also, something to look out for is the color patterns on the top of the head. Half-black bumblebees will often have yellow hairs, or they will have yellow hairs on the top of their head. The rusty patch bumblebee generally has mostly black hairs on the top of their head. I will sometimes get rusty patch bumblebees and perplexing bumblebees mixed up. Perplexing bumblebee is a bumblebee species that we covered last week, and their color patterns can be quite variable, and you will get some individuals that have a color pattern that is somewhat similar to that of a queen rusty patch bumblebee. So looking at our perplexing bumblebee, we see that this individual has a mostly yellow thorax, and then yellow on T1 and T2, just like you would expect to see for rusty patch bumblebee, and then the rest of the abdomen is black. Some things to look out for when you're differentiating between perplexing bumblebees and rusty patch bumblebee queens are, once again, the hair colors on the top of the head. Perplexing bumblebees have yellow hairs on the top of their head, whereas rusty patch bumblebees will be mostly black. The hair color pattern on the thorax is also something you're going to want to look at. Rusty patch bumblebees have black hairs in the center of their thorax, whereas perplexing bumblebees, they won't have any hairs at all that are black in between their two wing joints. It looks like there's a little spot there, but that is just caused by baldness. There aren't any actually black hairs in the middle of the thorax there. Just to note, perplexing bumblebee is another species where you will see dark hairs underneath the wing joints, just like you would see for the rusty patch bumblebee. So really, when you're trying to differentiate the species, you're going to want to look for those hairs on the top of the head, what's going on with the thorax, then also just sort of the general hair length and color. Perplexing bumblebees tend to be a lot shaggier looking than rusty patch bumblebee queens, and then the perplexing bumblebee also tends to be a little bit more golden in color in general than you would see for rusty patch bumblebee queen. All right, moving on to our next species, the red-belted bumblebee, Bombus rufocinctus. So this is a bumblebee species that you will find primarily in the upper Midwestern United States. So you see it quite often in Minnesota, you'll see it in the Dakotas. Not a species that you're going to be seeing a lot in Iowa, and one that you won't be seeing in Missouri. So this one has more of a northern range extent. This bumblebee species is very variable in its color pattern. So it's called the red-belted bumblebee because it often will have reddish hairs on its abdomen, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you'll have darker morphs that won't have any red hairs at all. So that is something to watch out for. So working backwards from the color patterns on the abdomen to the color patterns on the head. For the red-belted bumblebee, what we look for on the abdomen is a yellow, solidly yellow T1, and then a T2 with a yellow crescent shape. So sort of like the brown-belted bumblebee, you're going to expect to see a crescent of yellow hairs that do not extend quite all the way across the entire segment of that abdomen. T3 or parts of T3 and then T4 through 6 can be black or red or a combination of black and red. And then for some individuals, you may also see a stripe of yellow hairs on T4 and T5 or just on T4. So very variable in their color patterns on the abdomen. We'll go through some examples so you can really see what the variability of the color patterns for this species. The thorax of the red-belted bumblebee is going to be mostly yellow. They have a eye shape or an oval between their two wing joints, as opposed to sometimes you'll see bumblebees with a very solid black band. These bumblebees generally have more of an eye-shaped pattern. You can't quite see it here in this example photo, but we will be going through some examples where you can really see that eye shape on the thorax. All right, the last thing to note would be the color patterns on the head. So for females, you would expect to see black hairs on the front of the face and then yellow hairs on the top of the head. Also worth noting is the body size of these bees. These bees tend to be pretty small compared to some of the other species that you might encounter in the region. This is another species that have shorter cheeks, which gives them a rounder looking face when you look at them straight on. The males have a similar color pattern to the females. Once again, highly variable, although they are somewhat similar looking in their general rules of thumb. So if we work backwards from the abdomen to the head, for the abdomen of male red-belted bumblebees, you will generally see T1 and 2 both being solidly yellow. Occasionally, you'll see a male with more of a crescent shape on T2, but more often than not, T2 will be completely yellow for the males. So that's one good way to partially differentiate between males and females is looking at how many yellow hairs that they have on that second segment of the abdomen. For males, T4 through 7 can be black or red or partially black and partially red. And once again, they may have a stripe of red on either T4 or T5 or both on T4 and T5. The thorax for males also has that eye-shaped band in between the two wings. And then if you look at the head, they will have yellow hairs on the top of the head and yellow hairs on the front of the face. Another thing to look out for males of the species is the size of their eyes. So as we talked about last week, some bumblebee species have males with really large eyes. And this is a species where the males have slightly larger eyes than the females. So it's not quite as obvious of a difference as you would expect to see for the brown-belted bumblebee, but there is a slight difference in the size of the eyes between males and females for this species. All right, so let's look at some examples of individuals of the species. So here we have two female red-belted bumblebees, and as you can see, these guys are pretty different colors. We have a darker individual here on the right, and then a redder individual here on the left. So they look pretty different at first glance, but if you zoom in on what's going on with the color patterns, you will see some similarities. The first one being that both of these individuals have yellow on T1 and then a crescent shape of yellow on T2. On this individual, the rest of the abdomen is solidly red, but it has a stripe of yellow on T4 and then a little bit of yellow on T5. We see a similar coloring pattern here where the rest of the abdomen is black, but we have that stripe of yellow on T4 and a little bit of yellow on T5. You can also see on this be on the right that there is an oval or an eye shape in between the two wing joints. And then on this individual on the left, we see more of an oval shape or a circle shape, which will get occasionally, especially for queens of Bombus rufocinctus. So something to keep an eye out for. But for both of these, they do have dark hairs in between the wing joints, different levels of extent. All right, just to explore some of the variation that you might see in the abdominal patterns of these bees. As I mentioned previously, you can have individuals that will have almost all reddish hairs on T3, 4, and 5, and 6. And you will have some individuals that are darker, right? They will have dark hairs instead, and then you can have all kind of combinations in between. So this bee that is third most from the left, you can see it has that sort of traditional pattern that we would expect for a Bombus rufocinctus or red-belted bumblebee. It has a yellow thorax with an eye-shaped band in between the two wing joints, yellow on T1, and then that crescent shape on T2. But then the rest of the abdomen is an intermix of red and black. On this second individual, we see more yellow hairs, but the base pattern is the same, right? We have an individual with a mostly yellow thorax, an eye-shaped band between the two wing joints, yellow on T1, and then a crescent shape on T2. This individual has quite a few yellow hairs on its abdomen, so on T4 and 5, see lots of yellow hairs. And then On T3, we see reddish hairs, black hairs, and what looks like some yellow hairs. So sometimes you'll get some individuals that are very yellow, sometimes in part because the oranges hairs can get a little bit faded as the bee ages, so something to look out for as well. Right. So between these bees, we can see that they all have a mostly yellow thorax and that eye-shaped band, yellow on T1, and then that crescent shape on T2. Right, and then what's going on below just kind of depends on the species or on the individual that you're looking at. Sometimes you'll see mostly red hairs, sometimes you'll see mostly black, and then sometimes you'll see that stripe of yellow hairs on T4 and T5. Sometimes you won't. It really just depends on the individual. So taking a closer look at some females. Here we have a redder female. We can see that nice crescent shape on T2 of yellow, and then beneath that there are orange hairs. We can also see from this example that really nice eye shape of the band between the two wing joints. We also see that this individual has yellow hairs on the top of the head and black hairs on the front of the face. This individual is one that has that stripe of yellow hairs on the bottom of its abdomen. So on T4 and T5, we see some yellow hairs. Here we have a darker individual. Once again, we see that really nice eye-shaped band between the wing joints, a mostly yellow thorax, yellow on T1, that crescent shape on T2, and then we also see that stripe of yellow on T4 and T5. This is an individual that does not have that stripe of yellow on T4 and 5. So once again, this is a darker morph of this species. We have a mostly yellow thorax. The band here is not quite as extensive. It looks more like an oval than you would expect for a Bombus rufocinctus. And that's something that you get a lot with the queens especially, is that they have more of an oval shape as opposed to an eye shape. So something to look out for there. This individual also has a yellow T1 and then a pretty wide crescent there on T2. And then the rest of the abdomen is black. Just once again, looking at that individual I showed you earlier with lots of light hairs. Something to look out for this species is fading in the orange hairs. So sometimes you'll come across a Bombus rufocinctus that looks very yellow. And sometimes that's just because the hairs get really light, especially those orange hairs, as the bee ages. So that can make it a little bit tricky to identify them. But what you want to look out for is that eye-shaped band in between the wing joints. And then T1 being yellow, and then that nice crescent shape on T2. Here is another example of a red-belted bumblebee with a sort of more oval shape on the thorax. So this is a queen red-belted bumblebee, and you can see here that the shape on her thorax really looks more like a circle or an oval than an eye shape. It's still a pretty big circle of black hairs, but that is something to look out for, especially for the queens of this species. All right, the next bumblebee example I'm going to be showing you are the males of this species, so red-belted bumblebee males. As I mentioned previously, there can be some variation in the color patterns for males, just like the females. What you want to look out for, once again, is that eye-shaped band on the thorax, so mostly yellow thorax with that nice eye-shaped band in between the wing joints. Solidly yellow T1 and T2. On some individuals, you may see more of a crescent shape, but generally you're going to be seeing solid yellow on T2 for the males of this species. And then you may see, once again, some variation in the color patterns on the hair. Some individuals may be solidly red on T3 through 7. Some may be black, and then you'll get all sorts of combinations in between. Once again, the males will sometimes have stripes of yellow hairs on the abdomen on T4, T5. So once again, something to look out for as well. Here we have an example of a male that is quite a bit darker, but we see that eye-shaped band in between the wing joints, and then that T1 and T2 is solidly yellow. It's a little bit hard to see from this picture, but this individual also has some yellow hairs on T5 as well, making a little bit of a stripe of yellow hairs on the bottom of that abdomen. We can see from this picture that the hairs on the top of the head and on the face are yellow. All right, here we have an example of a yellower male. So this individual, if you look at the abdomen, has a lot of yellow hairs. It's solidly yellow on T1 and T2. And then on T3, we see some reddish hairs. And then on T4, 5, 6, and 7, we're seeing lots of yellow hairs. So sometimes you will get males of this species that are pretty yellow. One thing to really look out for, as I mentioned previously, with red-belted bumblebee males is the size of the eyes. So as I mentioned previously, the eyes of the males are going to be slightly enlarged compared to other bumblebee species. And this difference can be kind of subtle. So here on the left, we have a red-belted bumblebee male. You can see that the eyes are slightly enlarged here. On the right, we have a two-spotted bumblebee male, and their eyes are a little bit smaller. So for this species, making sure you get really good photos of the face is really important, especially for identifying the males to species, because this is a key thing that we look out for when we're differentiating red-belted bumblebee males and other species. All right, so as you can imagine, because of that color variability, red-belted bumblebees can be really easy to mix up with different bumblebee species. The thing that you really want to look out for is the presence of red hairs on the abdomen. If I see red hairs on the abdomen of a bee, that immediately makes me think potentially it could be a red-belted bumblebee. For darker morphs of red-belted bumblebees where you don't see any reddish hairs, key things to look out for is going to be the shape of that band in between the two wing joints. So if you're seeing an eye-shaped band there, that's a good cue that you're looking at a red-belted bumblebee. When you're comparing it to other bumblebee species that tend to have yellow hairs on, or that do have yellow hairs or crescents of yellow or brown hairs on T2, what you want to look out for this species is the pattern of those hairs. So if you're trying to compare it to the two-spotted bumblebee, red-belted bumblebees tend to have a wider crescent of yellow hairs than you would expect for a two-spotted bumblebee. Two-spotted bumblebees, they generally have that nice W shape, or on individuals that have fewer yellow hairs, their hairs are not going to be extending quite as far all the way to the margins of their abdomen as you might expect for a red-belted bumblebee. I think it can be easy to get red-belted bumblebees that are really dark mixed up with half-black bumblebees. If you remember from our webinar last week, half-black bumblebees are mostly yellow and they have yellow on T1 and T2. Red-belted bumblebees that are darker morphs can look a lot like that. This individual, at first glance has a similar color pattern. It's mostly yellow on the thorax, has yellow on T1, T2 is mostly yellow, and the rest of the abdomen is black. So things to look out for when differentiating these species is, once again, that pattern on the thorax. Do you see more of an eye shape as compared to a dot like you would expect for the half-black bumblebee? And then what's going on with T2? Are those yellow hairs extending all the way to the end of the segment, as you would expect for a half-black bumblebee? Or are you seeing more of a crescent shape like you would expect to see for a red-belted bumblebee? Another nice tip for this species is to look at the face. As I mentioned previously, red-belted bumblebees have really short cheeks. They have cheeks that are wider than they are long. Some of the other bumblebees that you might mix them up with, like the two-spotted bumblebee or the half-black bumblebee, have really long cheeks. So their cheeks are longer than they are wide. And so when you're differentiating between these species, that's another thing you want to look at and take photos of if you can. For the males, once again, you want to be making sure that you are looking out for reddish hairs on the abdomen. So if you're seeing red hairs on the abdomen of the bee, that's a great cue that you're looking at a red-belted bumblebee. Or that you could be looking at a red-belted bumblebee. There are other bumblebee species that have red hairs on their abdomen, but just as sort of a first cut. Dark morphs of red-belted bumblebee males, I think, look kind of similar to brown-belted bumblebee males. They have a similar body shape. Red-belted bumblebee males and brown-belted bumblebee males are sort of roundish, especially their thorax. So to look out for, things to look out for, once again, is that eye shape in between the wing bases. And then what's going on with T2? Are you seeing a solid color there, which would be indicative of a red-belted bumblebee? Brown-belted bumblebees, their crescent is generally smaller. And then once again, you want to look again at the eyes. Red-belted bumblebees have sort of a medium-sized eye. Brown-belted bumblebees, in contrast, have really large eyes. All right. The next bumblebee that we have on the docket is the tri-colored bumblebee, Bombus ternarius. And this is a bumblebee that you are going to be mostly finding in the northern Midwestern United States. So we see it quite a bit in Minnesota, North Dakota, and sometimes in Iowa, but is not a bumblebee species that you're going to be seeing across the Midwestern United States. This bumblebee gets its name because it is three-colored. It is red, yellow, and black. Zooming in to look at the color pattern on the abdomen. For this bumblebee species, T1 is going to be yellow. T2 through 3 will be orange, or sort of a bright reddish orange. T4 will be yellow, and then T5 and T6 will be black. The thorax of the females is going to be yellow with a black umbrella or thumbtack shape between the two wing joints. So sort of similar to the rusty patch bumblebee. And then if we look at the color patterns on the head, their hairs on the front of the face and the top of the head are going to be black. Sometimes there'll be a few yellow hairs mixed in there as well, but it will be mostly black hairs on their head. The males are very similar in their color patterns to the females. Looking at their abdomen, once again, T1 is yellow, T2 through 3 will be orange, T4 will be yellow, and then T5 through 7 will be black. They will also have a yellow thorax with a black umbrella shape in between their wings. For some individuals, it will look a little bit more like a band because that black umbrella isn't quite as distinct as you would expect for the females. And then in contrast to the females, they have yellow hairs on the top of the head, yellow hairs on the front of the face. So just looking at a few examples of tricolored bumblebee females, we can see from this example that this individual has a really nice umbrella shape of black on the thorax, so mostly yellow thorax with a thick band of black hairs that with a sort of handle of an umbrella that extends all the way to the bottom of the thorax. If we look at the abdomen, we can see that T1 is yellow, T2 and T3 are orange, T4 is yellow, and if we could see the very bottom of the abdomen, we would see that the rest of it is black. Another example of tricolored bumblebees, this is a worker. We see very clearly the color patterning on the abdomen. We see T1 is yellow, T2 and 3 are orange, T4 is yellow, and the rest of the abdomen is black. We see a really thick band of black hairs, right? That extends all the way down to the bottom, forming a sort of umbrella or thumbtack shape. And we can see from this example that the hairs on the top of the head and the front of the face are mostly black. Something to look out for the queens is the fact that the queen bumblebees of this species tend to have much neater looking hairs. They're a lot less shaggy than the workers. So this queen, right, the color patterning is exactly the same as the workers, but her hairs are a little bit neater looking than the workers' hairs. All right, this guy's pretty shaggy. This one is less so. Looking at the males, once again, we see very similar color pattern to the females. T1 is yellow, T3, T4 is orange, or sorry, T2, T3 is orange, T4 is yellow, and there are a few yellow hairs there on T5, but the rest of the abdomen is mostly black. We can see on this bee some black hairs that form that umbrella shape. For some males, this umbrella shape won't be quite as obvious as this, but we see on this example a nice umbrella shape there. And then we can see that this individual has yellow hairs on both the front of the face and the top of the head. Just to give you another look at those yellow hairs on the top of the face and the front of the head, or on the top of the head and the front of the face, we see quite a few yellow hairs, which is a great cue that this is a male that we're looking at. Once again, we can see that umbrella-shaped band between the wing bases that we want to look out for this species. All right, so as you can imagine, it can be really easy to mix up tricolored bumblebees with red-belted bumblebees. The thing to really look out for is what's going on the thorax and then on T2. So for tricolored bumblebees, they're going to have that umbrella or thumbtack shape, whereas red-belted bumblebees will have more of a eye-shaped band. And then on T2, the tricolored bumblebees are going to generally have a more solid color of orange. Red-belted bumblebees will have that yellow crescent there. Just taking another look at the thorax of these two different species, we see for the tricolored bumblebee that umbrella shape, and then for the red-belted bumblebee that eye shape. All right, the next bumblebee that we have on our list is Hunt's bumblebee, Bombus huntii. And this bumblebee looks a lot like the tricolored bumblebee. Fortunately, there's not a ton of overlap in their range, so we can mostly separate them out by where they're located geographically. This species is a more western species, and we really only see it in the Great Plains region and a little bit in western Minnesota. But in the area where these two species do overlap, it is something that we want to keep an eye out for. So as I mentioned previously, super similar color pattern to the females of this species. Or sorry, super similar color patterning to the tricolored bumblebee. The abdomen of this bee has yellow on T1, T2 through 3 orange, T4 black, or T4 yellow, and then T5 through 6 is black. The thorax has is yellow with a black band between the wings. So this is really more of a band as opposed to an umbrella or a thumbtack shape. And then notably, the hairs on the front of the face and on the top of the head are yellow for females. Looking at the males, we see basically the exact same color patterning. Yellow on the first segment of the abdomen, T2 through 3 orange. We see T4 yellow, and then we will see yellow on T5 as well for the males, and the rest of the abdomen is black. Once again, we see a black band between the wings, and then yellow hairs on the top of the head and the front of the face. So just looking at some examples of females of this species, we have a really nice example here of a female. We can see clearly that she has yellow hairs on T1, orange hairs on T2 and T3, and then yellow hairs again on T4, and then T5 and T6 are black. And then if we zoom in on the thorax of this bee, See that it's mostly yellow with a narrow strip of black in between the two wing joints. Looking at the face of the bee, you can see that there are profuse yellow hairs on the front of the face. Right? And if we once again look at the thorax, we see that this is really a band shape as opposed to an umbrella shape in between the two wings. Looking at the males, we see a similar color pattern to the females. We have bees with a mostly yellow thorax with a narrow band of black in between the two wing joints. We have yellow hairs on T1, and then T2 and 3 are going to be mostly orange. We see this male has a few yellow hairs on T2, which is something that you will see on occasion. So something to look out for both males and females of this species. And then for this male, we also see yellow hairs on T4 and T5. Pretty typical male of this species. So when differentiating between the tricolored bumblebee and Hunt's bumblebee, what you really want to look out for is the color pattern on the thorax. The tricolored bumblebee will have an umbrella shape, whereas Hunt's bumblebee will have a more narrow band of black hairs. Also, it's not super visible from these photos, but you also want to look at the hair colors on the face. Hunt's bumblebee will have profuse yellow hairs on the front of the face and the top of the head. The tricolored bumblebee will have mostly black hairs. For the males, something to look out for is what is going on with T5. So the tricolored bumblebee males, they will have yellow hairs on T4, and then sometimes they'll have some yellow hairs on T5. It just depends on the individual, but oftentimes they'll have black hairs on T5. Hunt's bumblebee males will generally have yellow hairs on T4 and T5. So not something that you can use to totally identify these two species, but just a tip when you're taking those first steps at differentiating between tricolored bumblebee males and Hunt's bumblebee males. I think we may be getting close to time here, but just really quickly, some tips on differentiating between Hunt's and red bumblebee males. Once again, or Hunt's and red bumblebee females. Once again, you want to look to see what's going on T2 for this species. In general, you are not going to see that many yellow hairs on T2 for Hunt's bumblebee. Sometimes you'll see a few hairs in the very middle of that segment that are yellow. More of a crescent of hairs on T2. Hunt's bumblebee females also have those copious yellow hairs on the front of their face, whereas red-belted bumblebee females will tend to have more dark hairs. Okay, and I think that I unfortunately am not going to be able to discuss yellow bumblebees and the northern amber bumblebee today. I apologize for that, you guys. I ran out of time, but I will make sure to touch on those next week for our next session. Thank you so much for joining us. We're super happy to have you, and we'll see you next week.